Introducing Portraits and Ideas. I'm Earl Ernest Guile, presenting interviews to inspire and perhaps unveil something new in the realm of ideas.
And to sort of tell you my story. I sort of got interested in the whole idea of longevity and aging years ago, and I thought that if I could read and keep up with the literature, particularly the peer-reviewed literature, that it would be something that I might be able to apply to my everyday life, and it certainly panned out that way. And so, in this particular field, there are a lot of exciting things that are happening, and I hope I can acquaint you with some of these. So you don't have to worry about taking notes. I have a limited number of handouts, actually, on some of this material. So I'd like to begin by presenting my mother, who just recently, in February, became 101 years of age. She has had a really wonderful life. She has attended 27 graduations of her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren in various universities across America. And I'd also like to honor and mention my wife's mother, who recently passed at the age of 98. And before she passed, she migrated to this country from Hong Kong and raised 7 children after her husband passed, and they all have advanced degrees and are doing very successful in America. So I would like to begin with a quote from Lao Tzu: "Health is our greatest possession. Contentment is our greatest treasure, and confidence is our greatest friend." So this was wisdom in 600 BC, when Lao Tzu was in China, and 1,000 years later, approximately, another scholar there made this statement, which resonates with the present information about nutrition. He said, "The less ones eat, the broader the mind, the longer the lifespan. The more one eats, the narrower the mind, the shorter the lifespan." So what are the prospects of curing aging and solving this long-standing issue that kings and emperors all tried to solve? We know about the terracotta warriors, right? That was a hope that we would have defenses in the afterlife, right? So if we look at some of the epidemiological data coming around today, we can see that there's been a lot of progress. Life expectancy has increased over 38 years from 1850 to 2011. China will have 200 million people over the age of 65 by 2030. So here's the toll that happens now in age-related diseases like cancer, heart disease, dementia. 100,000 people die a day across the globe. So that's an incredible figure that, with the research that's presently underway, we can potentially get a big reduction in that number. So, Professor at Harvard of Genetics, Church, he says that my lab is not really concerned with diseases of aging, which are the effects rather than causes. It's trying to get at the causes of aging and reverse them. We were just talking at the dinner table about some of the research now on actually reversing aging. So let's take a look at this graph here. You can see that, so the line at the end, the y-axis is really age 50. So we're looking at years after the age 50. So if we can cure cancer we'll only be adding just a few years beyond what is potentially possible without curing cancer. If we cure heart disease, we'll add a few more. If we cure both cancer and heart disease, we're only adding about, if you look at the chart there, it's only about 15 more years. But if we can slow down aging, we can really add a lot of years. And, that person could live to be 60 years, that'll be 110 years of age, right? If we could slow it down. And that's what the goal is in the aging research. So we're talking about a comparison of lifespan and health span. Health span is lifespan without the occurrence of age-related diseases. So here's a graph which I think can sort of explain that. What we're looking at is morbidity compression. So that normally if someone is aging like we normally do, we would have a gradual decline until, there's mortality. But if we could extend the vitality, that is, this is a measurement of reserve capacity. If we can extend it and then drop off at the end, then it would be a much more fruitful type of aging process that took place. You could enjoy it a lot more. You could travel. You could do a lot of things because you would maintain your functionality. So this could be you at 85. So some of the things that we want to cover, you might want to discuss it with your primary care doctor and let them know that you might be interested in anti-aging. So we would like to look at some of the research findings, look at some of the treatments that are around the corner, and then alarm you about the risk of not doing anything and engage you with the discussion. So there's actually is a fountain of youth that's around the corner. So the good news is that 70 is the new 50. So one of the examples that we were talking about at the table earlier is one of the blue zones, and one of the writers, Buchner, has written a book on this, and he talks about 5 or 6 places in the world where you have a high concentration of centenarians. And certainly we can learn a lot from looking at what centenarians are doing and try to put some of their lifestyle traits into our lives. So in Okinawa, you have about 740 centenarians in a population of 1.3 million. So if you look at the number of centenarians per 100,000, you have a very high number, 50. So that's in comparison to the U.S. having 22 per 100,000 population. Now, interestingly enough, 90% of these centenarians are women. So that's a whole nother debate as to why. So why is there an increase in Okinawa? Essentially, they have healthier lifestyles. There is preventive medicine that they're benefiting from. And also, there's better health care. But in Okinawa, they have, sort of perfected a lot of things that have benefited them. And so they're living closer to their genetic potential. So, for example, their average BMI, which is the body mass index, this is a measure of the, actually, it's a health measure that is generally between 18 and 24 or 25 is a healthy range. Over 25 is near obese, and then over 30 is obese. So they have a very lean body mass, and their average is quite low. And they're eating a low-calorie, unrefined, complex carbohydrate diet. And they have this habit, which we were talking about, of eating till they are partially full and leaving the table. And so that is actually a form of caloric restriction, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. This particular complex carbohydrate that they eat is purple, primarily purple potatoes, which you can find in the markets here, in the Asian markets. They experience slower age-related decline, and they have much lower rates of Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, and so on. And so here's a study that was done. They have less free radical damage, and they have the low caloric intake is one of the big advantages that they present for providing them with great health. And the elderly Okinawans have very clean arteries, low cholesterol, low homocysteine. And these factors help to reduce their risk of coronary heart disease. Their healthy arteries are mostly due to their lifestyle. And so there's a lot to be learned from the Okinawans. There's two brothers that actually has done a lot of the research. The Wilcox brothers went there many years ago, and they've been researching them as a long-term study. So here's an interesting graph which shows you how cardiovascular disease mortality increases with the level of homocysteine. This is a test that you can ask your primary doctor to do for you to see what your level is. So the higher the homocysteine, the higher the cardiovascular disease. So you can see Okinawa is in the lowest category, and in the USA, Finland, these countries have a higher level. And you might say, well, why is France and Spain at a low level? That's a good discussion because it might relate to the Mediterranean diet, olive oil consumption, and a few other factors like that could be protected. So they also have a low level of dementia there in Okinawa. Even in the late 90s, they suffered much lower dementia rates. So, for example, if we look at the prevalence of dementia in the U.S., Japan, and we're separating Japan from Okinawa, it's quite different. So Japan and the U.S. levels, by the time someone reaches the age of 80, are quite high, the percentage of the population. Okinawa is still quite low, almost half of what it is in the U.S. and Japan. And so we can see that there are a lot of statistics which support the Okinawan lifestyle. Here's a karate master from there at the age of 97. So in the U.S., one of the pioneers on the whole idea of slowing down aging was a professor at UCLA, Roy Walford. And he wrote a book called The 120-Year Diet. And he was one of the persons who was in the biosphere, that experiment a few years ago. And apparently there were some conditions in there that really reduced their oxygen intake, and there was a high level of carbon dioxide. And so subsequent to that, he actually acquired ALS, which he attributed to that particular exposure. But he was one of the pioneers who talked about humans living a lifestyle with caloric restriction like the Okinawans. So here are a couple of books. This is the book by the two brothers, the Wilcox brothers. They talk about the Okinawan program. Here's a very important study, the China study, where they actually compared villages in China. One village that had a high proportion of meat consumption, and another village that had a high proportion of plant consumption. And they found that the mortality rate in the meat consumption village was much, much higher than the one in the plant-based community. That was one of the chief findings of that. And then here are a couple of books that really talk about the lifestyle of reducing your caloric intake. And here's a group that's based out of New York that's a worldwide group that is trying to pursue a caloric restriction lifestyle, and they are also doing research. They're linking up with universities doing research to determine whether there are benefits from reducing the calories in their daily practice. So here's a projection on the number of centenarians we'll have by 2050. So right now we are in this range of centenarians in America, and then it's going to explode as we go forward. And this is going to be because of these advances in medical research in particular. And there are a lot of them on the horizon. And so if we look at the U.S. in comparison to other countries, our absolute number of centenarians is about 72,000 in 2015. But if we look at our number in reference to 100,000 people, it's much lower than, say, Japan or Italy in terms of the number of persons over 100. So moving on, we have a global projection of this kind of number by the time we reach 2050 globally. So it's very important if these people are getting old and they are infirm and not having good functionality, then it's going to be a big problem for the healthcare system and for families. And we know how it is when we have a disabled family member who, has a need for a lot of care. So here is an example of a person who reached the oldest age recorded. This lady, she passed in 1997, but she actually met Vincent van Gogh. And she was at the funeral of Victor Hugo.
Oh my gosh.
So there are accurate records in France, which, point out that this lady did actually live to be 122 years old. So here's one of our comedians that we knew about. He said that he was asked to stop smoking, and so the doctors who advised him to do that were all dead. So here are an example of some centenarians, and you can see how this guy is still doing business over an age of 100. And here's another one that's in actual races. I meet people at the pool where I met John, and they are quite robust in their 80s. There's one guy, you met Dave Radcliffe. Right. He performed in the Melbourne Olympics, and he's swimming, and he has about 4 master swimming world records, and he's right here in Oregon. So being active is very important. So another example of centenarians. So what can we do now? Basically, the important thing is for us to keep ourselves reasonably healthy until the new technologies arrive. You see? And we can call that a bridge to a bridge to a bridge. And what does that mean? You bridge yourself, say, another 20 years, and there'll be medical breakthroughs that will revitalize you, and you'll be healthy for another 20 years. You see? And actually, there's a concept called the takeoff velocity of aging, where the advances will go much faster than your longevity. So that means that as long as you stay out of accidents, you can keep going. So those are all the potentials within our lifetime. So one of the things that's going to really help us is artificial intelligence. And so a lot of times we see in the movies a lot of things about what AI is going to do in terms of being very dangerous for human civilization. Well, that's certainly a possibility if we are not careful. However, the potential for AI to save lives is enormous. And so it's already beginning to do that. And so we know that, for example, with self-driving cars, once that is in a full transition, we'll have probably 30,000 less automobile deaths on the U.S. roads a year. Furthermore, they also have developed, a lot of data in medicine now. Hospitals have accumulated enormous data with the electronic health records, and so as this data is evaluated with AI algorithms, there's a potential to find patterns that can save a lot of lives, and that's already happened in this category of diagnostics. There's a group in England called DeepMind that has done some research on aging using national health data in England, and they have been able to save a lot of patients from blindness because they are diagnosing optical coherence tomography of the retina much more rapid than humans, and so and they are very accurate, and so they can detect evidence of potential for blindness early and prevent it. And that's one example, but there's a huge other arena of diagnostics, particularly imaging, where cancers can be detected a lot earlier on radiographs and MRIs. Okay, drug development. We were just talking at the table about the problem now of antibiotics, where we've had too much overuse of antibiotics, and that we need new classes and categories of antibiotics to protect us because the microbes are very smart. They are mutating more rapid than our ability to manage them. And so we have superbugs that are really potentially great danger to us. And so AI will help us in developing new drugs by understanding protein folding in particular, solving doctor shortages. A lot of rural areas in the world and a lot of developing countries, they don't have enough doctors, so we can use AI to evaluate the data that comes in from these areas, and they can make diagnosis and therapeutic decisions along with doctors, say, in a remote location. And also, that links into the telemedicine, where people can actually be educated and informed on new developments using AI. So, one of the things about the future technologies is that they'll be accelerating rapidly, and it's not linear anymore, it's logarithmic, meaning that the things that used to take decades to occur will now be happening much shorter time frames. And some of these situations that are developing will pose ethical dilemmas that we will need to solve. And so we need to be really anticipatory about all of these major changes that are going to be taking place so that people can really be ahead of the curve. So this could be you at 110, right? So what are the factors influencing longevity and health span? Well, we have genetic factors. What is the nutrition that you're consuming on a daily basis? What is your lifestyle, especially in terms of activity, exercise? What is the environment you live in? If you're living in a place where there are inversion layers and the air is polluted all the time, that can be as dangerous as smoking cigarettes. So, and then there's chance, random occurrences of events, accidents. So one of those things about exercise that is really good is Tai Chi, one of the ancient Chinese traditions that goes back thousands of years, and it's proven. If you do a Google on Tai Chi, you'll see so many evidence-based benefits that come from this practice. I had the fortunate experience of learning to do Tai Chi about 15 years ago, and I've been an active practitioner since. So I was lucky to go on a tour to China with a group of Tai Chi instructors from the UK. And fortunately, the leader of that group was the son-in-law of one of the 100 master treasures of China in martial arts, Li Dayan. So this is me with Li Dayan and my wife over in Beijing at his studio when we were on that tour. So what are some of the theories of aging? There are two basic patterns or currents. One is programmed aging, and the other is aging based on damage to the body. So in the programmed category, so this is what a theory about we are programmed to live a certain time frame. And this is based on upregulation and downregulation of specific genes associated with cellular senescence. So what is cellular senescence? These are cells that actually, they don't die completely, but they are not functional. They stick around, but they cause a lot of damage to neighboring cells through inflammation. So the ideal scenario is to be able to get rid of these cells that become senescent. And so there are new current approaches, something called senolytics, which is one of those things which can actually help to clear cells that are senescent from the body. Another one is the endocrine theory, and I'm sure Dr. Lee's son would have a lot of expertise on this. He's an endocrinologist, and so hormones regulate aging, and this particular pathway called IGF-1 is a critical one. So in your youth, IGF-1 is important because it stimulates cell growth, but as you get older, we want to downregulate IGF-1. And that's one of the important things in pre-diabetes and diabetes when IGF-1 gets high, and it affects the whole insulin metabolism system. So then there's also the immunological theory, where a lot of the antibodies that were formed in your youth lose their effectiveness. So you have a general decline of the immune system, which is very problematic when we are exposed to so many microbes and so on. So what about the damage-based version of aging? So there's the wear and tear. So over time, like for example, if you're a marathon runner, I've heard and talked to some friends of mine who've done it over the years, and their knees wear out. So this is an example of wear and tear, overuse of certain body functions in the body, parts of the body. So the rate of living. So here is a pathway, another one, in addition to the IGF-1, is called the mTOR. And I'll have another slide on that in a minute, but that's one you want to downregulate as well, because that one is also, it's beneficial in your youth, but as you get older, it becomes detrimental. So it has, a dichotomous type of relationship to the body. And then there's the cross-linking theory, which these are the proteins that don't fold properly. And so as you get older, that kind of damage occurs, and so function within the cells will slow down as those proteins are degraded. And then you have a free radical theory. So you have these free radicals that move around and they cause damage, and that's another one that we can hopefully suppress with anti-aging approaches. So what about the hallmarks of aging? We can't really see a lot of the details on this, so I'll just move into each item. And so in order to qualify as a hallmark, a characteristic should occur during normal aging. And if you add them together, you should actually accelerate aging. And so if you block them, you should be able to slow down aging or mitigate aging. So these are the key ones that were on that circular diagram a minute ago. Proteostasis is very important. So as that's related to the whole idea of the function of the proteins, and if those protein functions decline, that's going to be an indication of aging. Deregulated nutrient sensing, that is mitochondrial dysfunction. So within the cells, we all know that mitochondria are the energy portions of the cell where it generates, particularly in muscle cells, and also all cellular types. And so there's DNA within mitochondria that becomes damaged. And so when people are infirmed and they have difficulty walking as they get older, it's a result of mitochondrial dysfunction. So that's another hallmark. Cellular senescence, which we talked about a little bit earlier, and the exhaustion of stem cells. Stem cells, when they're available in youth, they can become almost any tissue type. And so as we get older, we have a big loss of stem cells. So a part of the anti-aging approach is to stimulate mature adult cells into pluripotent stem cells. And so another hallmark is altered intracellular communication, that is, between cells. The communication is very important, especially in the formation of tissues and so forth. And so that could also relate to instability in the genome, that is DNA damage, which is not being repaired. And then we talked about that earlier as well, telomere attrition, and then epigenetic alterations. So this takes us to something that we talked about a little bit earlier, caloric restriction. It's actually, up to now, the only proven method of extending longevity. And this experiment in 1935 really exposed this idea in a rodent model. So in a control group, they reduced their calories by about 40% in these rodents. And then they compared it to another group, which had all the food that they could want 24/7. And so that group that they restricted the calories lived about 40% longer than the other group. And so the interesting thing about this is, so it is defined as the reduction of energy intake without malnutrition. So even though you reduce your calories, you got to make sure you still have all the nutritional components that are important. So here's another graph of that, where the colors represent different levels of caloric restriction: 25%, 55%, 65%. So this is the age in months of the mice, and this is the survival. So you can see that the non-CR mice lived the shortest. They lived about 35 months. The highest caloric restricted mice, the red, they lived about 55 months. It's like 20 months longer than those mice. So that's evidence about the efficacy of caloric restriction in mice. But what about humans? We don't really know for sure, but clearly there has been evidence in species from yeast to primates that caloric restriction is effective in extending the lifespan. So here are some of the benefits of caloric restriction. You have, it preserves cognition, which is the most important thing, right? And so it delays osteoporosis. It protects colon health. It delays brain atrophy. It prevents age-related diabetes, and so on. And this is not an exhaustive list of what caloric restriction can do. So the objective is to activate what we might call the evolutionarily conserved pathways that and aging regulators that the body has. So why is that? If you look at the evolution of Homo sapiens, going back, I think the evidence now is actually 300,000 years that Homo sapiens appeared on Earth. And so during that long period leading to modern times, people lived a nomadic existence where they would go out for the hunt and find food, and then they would go long periods without food. So during those periods without food, the body developed mechanisms that protected particularly the neurons, because it wanted to make sure you were smart enough to find the next food source. So what happens in modern society? Our fridges are full. We eat 24/7. So as a result, those pathways that protect us lay dormant. They don't get activated. So the whole idea behind caloric restriction is to activate those protective pathways. So what it does, it extends longevity, both medium and maximum lifespan. And so this is yeast here. This is a worm, C. elegans. These are flies, fruit flies. And then we have rodents, rotifers, silkworms, spiders, fishes, dogs, and rhesus monkeys. All these that they've done experiments on caloric restriction and have found that it extended their lifespan. So we're talking about the cell. This is a eukaryotic cell. This is a prokaryotic cell. And about 1.8 billion years ago, eukaryotic cells were formed from a type of cell called archaea and actually bacteria. And so these components, this is a mitochondria within the cell. It's theorized that this was actually bacteria that got engulfed by the cell, and that became the engine of motion and movement of the cell. This is where we get our energy from. And so cells are extremely concentrated. Within one cell is 10 to the 10th proteins in one cell. So if you think about the volume that is in terms of the amount, it tells you how intricate a cell is. And somebody has said that a cell within one cell is far more complicated than an entire city like New York. So we want to make sure that these cells are getting the proper nutrition and that we are stimulating the right pathways in these cells that protect us. So these are those pathways that need to be manipulated that we were discussing. And they are called nutrient sensing pathways. And what does that mean? That means that when you take in a nutrient, it depends on the type of nutrient, it'll stimulate these pathways. So the one on the top is one of those pathways that we want to upregulate, meaning that we want that to be activated. And the second one is one that we want to downregulate, particularly as we get older. And we want to upregulate the sirtuins. These are what we call silent information regulators. And we want to downregulate the IGF-1, upregulate this one, and upregulate FOXO. So here's a little bit more details on those. So what is AMP kinase? Well, what it does, it actually stimulates these sirtuins that we mentioned earlier. And also it increases something called NAD+. So when these are stimulated, we get mitochondrial biogenesis, which is a positive thing. We get new mitochondria forming. And also it actually downregulates mTOR, which we talked about as a disadvantaged one. And so you get mitochondrial protective benefits. And so it changes the adenosine monophosphate to adenosine triphosphate ratio in mitochondria, increasing the biogenesis and promoting insulin sensitivity. And that, in turn, will prevent you from getting diabetes if you have strong insulin sensitivity. So the other one, mTOR, mechanism target of rapamycin. So we want to reduce that because it will reduce protein synthesis and promote something called autophagy. So what is autophagy? That is a system where the components in cells that break down get recycled, and they can be reconstructed into components that will benefit you. So that's something that gets stimulated by caloric restriction as well, and that's a very positive type of function that occurs. And here's a group of genes that are involved in the aging and death of cells, and so these are there are 7 in mammals, and they are involved in at least 24 molecular and cellular functions that are beneficial. So we want to definitely stimulate the sirtuins. And so this is the pathway that we want to reduce. And so it's very strongly linked to the insulin metabolism. And so it helps to control the blood glucose when you have a reduced IGF level. So for example, when you consume a lot of sugar, it upregulates IGF to your disadvantage. So you want to definitely be downregulating it. And so here's another one, and we were talking about this earlier as well. So sulforaphane, it activates this pathway, and it affects the expression of about 200 genes. And so these genes will protect against oxidative damage, and also that's triggered by injury and inflammation. And so we know that inflammation, when you have an injury, is positive, but actually chronic inflammation is very, very negative for the body. So one of the best sources of sulforaphane is actually broccoli, and more particularly broccoli sprouts. I don't know if anyone of you consume broccoli sprouts, but that has 50 times more sulforaphane than broccoli itself. So it's very advantageous to grow your own broccoli sprouts. Yeah. What does it look like? Actually, I grow it myself, and it looks like any sprouted plant, but it's a little smaller than say, what is the most common sprouts that we use? Bean sprouts, right? It's a little bit smaller. But if you take those broccoli sprouts after they mature after 3 or 4 days, and then put them in the fridge and freeze them, they actually produce more sulforaphane. So it's a very sulforaphane. Look it up. It's a really very positive thing. There is another pathway which helps to keep inflammation low. And when they test these centenarians, they find that they have this pathway activated because it's very characteristic of centenarians. So it's associated with prolonged functionality and cognitive ability. So back to autophagy, and this is a catabolic process that breaks down the cellular components and recycles them. So if we're not having that, and they also eliminate the senescent cells that cause inflammation. So if we're not having autophagy occurring, these senescent cells will sit there and cause inflammation and cause damage. And we don't get those things that are broken down recycled. So here are some of the biomarkers. We can't read that, so we'll move to the next slide. So what are the factors that most strongly impact our quality of life as we age? So this study by the MacArthur study of successful aging at UCLA, they found that a high level of engagement, and we'll talk about that a little bit. What does that mean? A low risk of disease, high physical and cognitive function levels. Those are those characteristics they find. And so here's a 10-step plan to achieve longevity. Having a good diet, exercise the body and mind, nutritional supplementation with phytonutrients, like sulforaphane, for example, avoidance of chemical contamination, stress reduction, compassion, change of thinking. The brain is plastic, and even in elderly. So do things that stimulate the brain to change, like take trips, try new hobbies, avoid accidents, stay educated, don't get sick, spread the word. And so there's a new field of psychology that was developed at my own university, the University of Pennsylvania, where this guy, Martin Seligman, he came up with the idea that basically, historically, psychology has focused on pathology and not on how can we really take what is normal and make it even better. So the idea is this acronym called PERMA. And so the goal is to reach a mental state of well-being, right? So the first thing that he focuses on is the idea, and by the way, they've done evidence-based research on all of these factors. Pursuing positive emotions. For example, when you have a good meal like you had tonight, think about it tomorrow and savor it. When you have a birthday celebration, not just the day of the celebration, celebrate it for a month. When your child achieves something fantastic, like Dr. Lee's 3 sons, 2 sons and a daughter, right? They have done extraordinarily well, like I'm sure most of your children have. And savor that, because that is pursuing a positive emotion about things in life. Secondly, engagement. Whenever you have a hobby, be like Picasso. Even if a hurricane comes, it wouldn't disturb his painting because he's in the zone, right? Focusing. Or Tiger Woods playing golf. He's learned years ago from his father to focus and not let any disturbance keep him from playing. So that's a good example of what we should all do whenever we pursue our hobbies or our activities in life that benefit us. Relationships, probably the most important. Relationships in your family, relationships in your occupation, relationships in your community. Have positive ones. And send out, one of the things that Siegelman has done, he says, what you should do is send out an email to 3 of your friends from years ago, praising them about something. He said it would do you better than it would the person receiving that email. And it's like people, you've heard this, when people give money to charity or to something, it actually has a really positive effect on their whole mental apparatus and thought process. So that's the whole idea of relationships, meaning. So when you pursue something, try to have a meaning in life. And some of the newer proponents talk about develop something called a massive transformative purpose. So that whatever you are doing, try to make sure that not only can it affect your family, but it can affect people beyond your family. And they even talk about do something like affect billions of people if you can, So think that way. And so that's the whole idea of meaning. So once you accomplish those first 4 items, you will reach a level of achievement where you can say, I've really reached certain goal, and that's an achievement that I can savor, and it can recycle back to looking at that as a positive experience. So one last item that I want to cover is the idea of fasting. So there are many ways in which you can reduce the calories you take. So you can do it on a daily basis, and we call that intermittent fasting, where you reduce the number of calories in a 24-hour cycle. But you can also fast for several days. And what they found is that in the research that it can help you reduce weight, optimize health, and delay aging. And what it does, it kicks in those metabolic pathways which we talked about that were very healthy. And so there are a lot of ways of fasting. One is you can do alternate day fasting, intermittent fasting, or periodic fasting. And so periodic fasting would be where you would go for several days, 3 or 4 days, some longer. And then intermittent fasting where you actually narrow your window of eating to like 6 hours a day and have the other 18 hours of fasting. So for example, you wake up in the morning and you say you eat a breakfast, say at 9 o'clock, and then say by 3 o'clock you don't eat anything else till the next day. So that you actually will begin to stimulate those dormant pathways that we talked about. And there's a researcher, I have a list of references that there's a researcher at UCLA, Walter Longo, who has written a book called The Longevity Diet, and he talks about various types of fasting. And he's done a lot of research showing the benefits of fasting. And he's actually shown how fasting, along with chemotherapy, can have very serious effects on tumor suppression and tumor reduction, actually, in cancers. So these are different types of fasting. You have a 16-8 method, fast for 16 hours, a 5-2 method where for 2 days, you eat a much lower amount. Eat, stop, eat, do 24-hour fast once or twice a week. And actually, I started, one of the things that got me into this anti-aging was a fasting protocol that I started about 30 years ago. And I didn't really know what the benefits were, but I was reading a lot. When I was young, my parents moved from town to country. So I was in a place where I didn't have any friends. So who became my friends? Books. And so I started reading everything I could get my hands on. And then I came across fasting, particularly stories like Mahatma Gandhi and how he used fasting for political success of freeing India from British colonial rule. And so I said, well, hey, let me look into this and start reading about it. So I didn't really, in fact, the research had not been done on the benefits of it. But then I started this protocol of a 42-hour fast on a weekly basis, and I did it for years. And so I think I've benefited a lot from that, especially as I've learned about the, how should we say, the benefits of it from the research. So that concludes my talk, and I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to present some ideas that may have some utility in life. And by the way, I have a set of handouts, a limited amount, and I'll put them on the table. And actually, I have a book that I recently published called The Singularity Prize, and it's about the potential for AI having a dramatic impact on our lives. And so I have some free copies of that book that I will leave on the table as well. So anybody who's interested can get copies. Thanks again. And if you have any questions, no. So interestingly enough, my mother never followed any fasting routine.
Please repeat the question. And then...
Oh, the question is, did my mother do any fasting? And to this day, she's still very active, but she hasn't fasted. I would say, if I look at what the secret to my mom's success with aging is, she started exercising at a very early point. She always liked to say, I was jogging before it became a fad, right? And she also took up a hobby. She was a seamstress, and when she retired from being a seamstress, she started China painting. And so she took courses, different parts of the country, went back, and she has a huge collection of China painting. And this is, an art form that started like in I think, one of those early dynasties in China, And so I would say her focus on the visual arts and pursuing that sort of thing. And she was very active in the civil rights movement along with my father. My father was the president of the NAACP in my hometown during the height of the civil rights era. And so she was involved in that, and she was also very active in family matters and friends. She has a huge social network. She's 101 years old. She still drives, right? She goes twice a week to card games. She plays bridge, and she plays pinochle with two different groups. She goes to church every Sunday, mostly, and then she goes shopping. So I've been trying to tell her that we need to switch over to Uber. but she's led a remarkable life. Pardon? She lives independently, right. My father passed quite a few years ago, so she's been independent for a long time. Any more questions? Yeah.
They say that it's important to eat breakfast, but I'm thinking if you skip breakfast and wait for lunch, that's like a 12-hour fast. Would that be important?
Yeah, well, that's all of those strategies for reducing the window of eating is going to be confer benefits, So, you have a lot of debates about, you need a breakfast for energy. So, you've got to really look at the literature and see what it comes up with in terms of how best to do it. I think the guy Valtalongo at UCLA, and I have a list in my handout. I have a list of references, and go check out his stuff. And he's I would say one of the experts on fasting. And the other one is a guy named Jason Funk. He has a book about fasting, which is very good, and I have that in a list of references as well. I would think that children is a bit early, because here's what happens with caloric restriction. Even in, say, if you say a species that's reached adulthood, even after, if they had not practiced caloric restriction and they started in adulthood, it still confers tremendous benefits, And I think they probably do experiments with young mice and so on, but I'm not quite sure of evidence that it is harmful. I think, for example, in those blue zones, they may have places where the younger follow the same pattern as the adults in terms of the eating habits. So I haven't seen evidence of harm. And it's something you can say, do a search, caloric restriction, harm to young, and see what comes up. Yeah. In the peer-reviewed literature, right? That's important. Yeah.
I'm in healthcare field myself, and one of the things that we're noticing is just a change is our population gets older and older. We're also seeing changes in healthcare costs and healthcare benefits. So if we're starting to get older and older, how do you see that as being a positive and or a negative impact on healthcare costs to our aging population?
I think if we don't cure age-related diseases, it's going to be a disaster, because the number of people who are over the age of 65 is really growing rapidly, and they project that by 2030 it'll be 38% of the population. So we'll have a third of the population, over a third, having, say, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, and that's going to be incredibly expensive. Even diabetes today has an enormous impact, with the complications of diabetes, which is an age-related disease as well as, just a lifestyle disease. And so one of the things I do now is health consulting. I go and evaluate primary care programs, and so HHS has designated this year as a year to focus on diabetes. So we are looking at every program focusing on how they can reduce the number of diabetic patients they have in their program. And so if you can move the needle just a slight bit, it can save billions of dollars from, say, things like renal failure that occurs with diabetes, amputation, blindness. All those things can be mitigated, with a focus on curing these age-related diseases. And so the advantage of focusing on, say, using those natural mechanisms that we already have in our makeup, we can actually have a long health span before people decline, And so that would, if people could age, and have a lot of function, that would be the miracle that we're looking for. But if people are aging the way they're aging now, where most of the money in the healthcare system is going toward people who are over the age of 65, right? Just a few decades before death. So consequently, if people can be healthier, that can reduce the expenditures for health enormously. No. I would suggest that you continue to enjoy these wonderful dinners, because they're the best, in my opinion. And so, life has to have some joy, right? And this is definitely one of them. And think about the social networking that's happening right now just to come together and have a meal. It's so important. You'll get more advantages from this social networking than any disadvantages you might get from the meal. But I think the meal is healthy, in my opinion. It's a very healthy meal. To what? To medicalize? Medicalize aging. It's a natural process, right? Yeah. So here's a big debate that's happening now. So some people say, well, why should we tamper with a natural process? You can make an analogy, say, well, it's a natural process that we don't fly in the air, right? But what happens when the Wright brothers invented the airplane? Look what has happened. It's changed our way of life completely, and we can't really say that because we weren't born to fly, that we are not able to fly. So now on aging, the idea is that in order to get funding to do research on aging, and they've got one study that's happening right now, that we should describe aging as a disease. Okay, so basically, there's a trial going on now using metformin, which is a common diabetes medication, and they're checking out how metformin can have benefits to people who don't have diabetes. So what does that mean? What is metformin? Metformin is something called a CR mimetic. And a mimetic is something that mimics CR, but you don't have to reduce your calories. You can just take a pill. And metformin has a tremendous amount of benefits beyond treating a diabetic patient.
Whose idea is it? A pharmaceutical's idea?
To do the research? No. The pharmaceutical industry doesn't have any interest in people, take a medication that they advertise during the news at night for the rest of your life, right? They're not gonna. For example, metformin is a tremendously beneficial medication that comes from a lilac plant, and it's been around for the last 40 years, 50. I'm not sure how long they've been using. And it's a very safe and it's very cheap. It's the cheapest medication you can find because it's not being produced by Big Pharma. It's a generic. And so the Big Pharma wants to produce an expensive drug that you're going to take the rest of your life. That's why they don't do research on antibiotics, the new classes of antibiotics that we need, because they're not going to make as much money off of that as they would off of a chronically taken drug.
So is the Earth sustainable if the population never decreases?
Well, yeah, that's another debate about how much can we hold, right, on the planet.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is, AI is going to help us, solve that.
16 million.
That's right. That's the planetary.
60
Yeah.
million.
And then we should start to kill them all.
Or go to another planet. Go to another planet, right? Become a multi-planet species. Okay. Thank you very much.